You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hi, my name is Robin Erickson, and I'm a principal researcher in the Human Capital Center at the Conference Board. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights, a podcast series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, Rebecca Ray, Executive Vice President of the Human Capital Center, and my co-author is joining me to discuss the results from a recently published report about changes around the globe in employee sentiment and how organizations are rising to the challenge of meeting even higher employee expectations. In 2019, we published Higher Expectations, How Organizations Engage with Social Change Issues. In 2020, the Conference Board decided to repeat the 2019 survey to see whether organizations are responding differently to social change issues and whether employees think differently about how organizations should respond. So, hi, Rebecca. Could you start us off by talking about what compelled us to do research on this topic of social change again in 2020 and give us a quick overview of the study?
Certainly, Robin. It's a pleasure to be here with you. In November of 2019, we watched the advent of COVID-19 begin to spread throughout the world. And as it became a pandemic, it quickly spread, not just globally, but it had a domino effect that demonstrated some concerns in the healthcare systems, both in our country and that of others, and it cracked under the pressure of managing the magnitude of serious and fatal cases. And the shock of that pandemic and the shutdown measures plunged the global economy into a severe contraction, and millions lost their jobs or were furloughed or laid off, at least temporarily. And remote work became the norm whenever possible due to government-mandated lockdowns. So it's against this backdrop that you started to see fissures in other parts of society as well. In May of 2020, George Floyd was killed while in police custody in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And that erupted in protests around the United States, but also around the world. And many people spoke out against police brutality. And, I think the protests did strike a chord with many organizations, and their leaders were compelled or felt compelled to speak out on these issues. So in 2019, we had looked at how organizations respond and how the employees want their organizations to respond, whether it's just internally or externally, whether it's about certain issues and not other issues. But there's a lot of pressure today to respond in a way that satisfies, hopefully, a variety of stakeholders. But that was something we wanted to make sure we looked at again in 2020. You couldn't have picked a more challenging year against which to gauge attitudes around social change issues. So we decided that we would take the same human capital related social change issues and measure in a short survey people's attitudes. We had about 850 global respondents, mostly within the US, certainly, and a literature review to try to see what indeed had changed, if anything, and then what that might tell us.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, for the background information. Consistent with our findings from 2019, our 2020 research found that silence on social change issues or simply not responding is becoming less of an option for many organizations. In our 2019 survey, 98% of respondents felt that organizations should respond to social change issues at least some of the time. And then in 2020, the results were similar, with 99% responding that they thought organizations should respond at least some of the time. And almost 3/4 of those in 2020 stated, yes, organizations should respond to social change issues all the time. As I mentioned earlier, organizations are rising to the challenge of meeting rising employee expectations. For instance, multiple organizations have voiced support for Black Lives Matter on social media. Many organizations receive positive reactions from their employees who express pride in their company's involvement in social change issues. And then in addition, they are also proud that their organizations are responding to social issues because it helps some organizations attract new employees. So according to our research, the employee expectation that organizations respond to social change issues is not based on geography, gender, or generation, but the majority of respondents across the geographies, generations, and genders all agreed that organizations should respond to social change issues. However, there are some slight variations. For example, in North America, women were more likely than men to respond yes to the question, do you think organizations should respond to social change issues? 75% of the women said yes. Only 63% of the men said yes. And then in terms of generations, slight difference, millennials and Generation X respondents were more likely to respond yes than the baby boomers. And so the millennials were at 76, the Gen Xers were at 74, compared to the baby boomers at 68%. So Rebecca, please share what we found when we asked employees which social change issues they care the most about.
Yeah, sure, Robin. Just one thing I find it fascinating. It's a difficult navigation for organizations, right? I mean, they can speak out on an issue, and it perhaps is the deeply held view of a senior leader, and quite often it's the CEO or the CHRO or other senior leaders who are the face of the response. But you run a risk that not every employee feels the same way that the organization is choosing to respond. So you sometimes have to be very thoughtful about how you're responding so that you don't alienate one group or another. And we also know that sometimes perceptions change. And one thing that you said one week then becomes or falls out of favor at a future time. So it's not an easy thing to get right, is it, Robin?
It really isn't, especially when you think about it's not only employees that you're worried about it, but it's customers and your stakeholders as well.
Absolutely. And that stakeholder list gets bigger and bigger all the time, doesn't it? So, when we looked at what social change issues they cared the most about, in our survey, we asked respondents to select the top 3 social change issues that were most important to them personally out of a list of 16 diversity, equality, and inclusion-related issues. Racism was the most important social change issue globally and in Europe, the Middle East and Africa, and North America. And while there was minimal regional variance for the top 2 issues of racism and gender inequity, there were regional differences for others. Unequal access to healthcare and well-being ranked higher for employees in North America than for employees in other regions. Healthcare and well-being are top of mind for employees in the United States, possibly because the COVID pandemic exposed such vulnerabilities in the U.S. healthcare system. For example, research from Yale and the University of Pittsburgh and others reveals that there's a disproportionately high mortality rate for the Latino and Black communities due to COVID-19. So another difference was in unemployment. So that was the most important social change issue in Asia Pacific, and it ranked even higher than racism and gender inequity. The slowdown in Western economies has been detrimental to labor markets in many export-dependent Asian countries, so perhaps that's what's driving that. I mean, Hong Kong, for instance, experienced the sharpest rise on record of the number of underemployed workers from May to December, and the ranks of Japanese employees who were, quote, not at work, end quote, rose from 2.5 million in March to a record 6 million in April, reaching an 8.8% of the labor force.
Thanks so much, Rebecca, for sharing what's most important to employees around the world. At this point in our program, we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue discussing the latest insights about how organizations are responding to social change issues.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello again. I'm Robin Erickson with the Conference Board. Welcome to the second half of our podcast, and thanks for joining me and Rebecca Ray, Executive Vice President of the Human Capital Center, and my co-author, as we discuss the rising employee expectations that organizations should respond to social change issues, and then what social change issues matter the most to employees. Our research found some gender and generational differences in how employees rank the importance of several social change issues. When it came to gender differences, ranking for gender inequity showed the largest gap between women and men. It was a 32% difference, with women more likely to respond that gender inequity is one of the top 3 most important issues to them personally. Other research has shown that women are less optimistic about achieving gender equality in the future. The second largest gender gap was found for rankings of the issue of unemployment. More men place importance on unemployment than women do, a 12% difference between men and women. The Conference Board survey was conducted in July 2020 when unemployment was high in many geographies. However, it's interesting to note that by December of 2020, the unemployment rate for women in the U.S. was higher than that of men. Other issues that are more important to women than men are racism and unequal access to healthcare and well-being. Conversely, nationalism and religious intolerance were more important to men than women. For the generational differences, the top 2 social change issues were racism and gender inequity, just as Rebecca had mentioned. That was across all generational groups. But the top 5 social change issues for baby boomers and Gen Xers were the same. However, the millennials, they chose benefit and equity rather than nationalism in their top 5. And LGBTQ plus inequity also ranks in the top 5 for millennials, tied with unemployment. In terms of unequal access to healthcare and well-being, this is a more critical issue for millennials than for other generations and ranks 3rd. Ageism ranks lower for this group as well. Some distinctions between the baby boomers and Gen Xers. Baby boomers place more importance on ageism and gun violence. Gen Xers rank LGBTQ plus inequity and benefit inequity higher. So if you're interested, please feel free to check out the report on our website. There'll be a link to it in the notes here. But given that racism and gender inequity are the most important social change issues for employees, Rebecca, please share a few examples of how organizations have responded to these issues.
Sure. Again, there are a lot of organizations who've kind of figured out some way to kind of get through, a response that aligns with their values or that they think positions them to be supportive of a variety of issues. And so we saw responses to racism in particular vary by organization and by country. So in the US, you had corporations like Nike, Twitter, Citigroup publicly aligned themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement. And in some cases, organizations took direct action to show their support. So Uber, for example, removed delivery fees for items purchased from Black-owned businesses. Salesforce started a racial equality and justice task force, which was focused on people, philanthropy, purchasing, and policy. And they tapped employees at all levels to get that done. And the founder and former CEO of Reddit, Alexis Ohanian, stepped down from his position on the board and requested that his position be filled with a Black board member. So in terms of commitment toward gender inequity, the tide, I think, is beginning to slowly turn. A lot of countries have enacted legislation to address the gender pay gap. The U.S. lags these countries in terms of public policy and requirements around gender equity, but it's beginning to see some actions being taken in the private sector, particularly in academia and in financial services. So, for example, Princeton University announced that it would pay female professors nearly $1 million in back pay, and J.P. Morgan announced that it would pay almost 100 female employees at least $800,000 in back pay. So the pay inequity challenge is not an easy one to fix, but it is fixable, and it is something that corporations can control within their walls. So many companies are rolling out programs to address racism and gender inequity. Adidas recently gave a progress update on how it and its sister company Reebok are trying to create lasting change on both issues globally, including changing the hiring and career development programs and investing over $135 million to support Black and Latinx communities. Bristol Myers Squibb, for example, invested $300 million to reduce health disparities and to increase representation of diverse groups within the company.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights, Rebecca, on how companies around the world are actually dealing with these two very important social change issues. And to all of our listeners, we hope that you've enjoyed today's podcast and have a better idea of how organizations are engaging with social change issues. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you would like to find out more, please visit our website at tcb.org/podcasts or /webcasts for more interactive programs. You can also find our podcasts on other platforms like iTunes or Spotify. Thanks again and have a great day.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.